if you were at the South Indian corner there, we recently did a story on sambar and how climate change is coming for your sambar. Tur dal, right? The production of tur dal has been fluctuating over the last decade because of climatic changes, right? And prices have shot up. Please look up that story. It's a very interesting one, but just illustrates the lived experience of climate change. Of course, we have heard stories of apple production going down in Himachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir as well. And 2 months back, we were in the middle of a heat wave, right? And 2 months after, parts of our cities are flooding. These are all lived experiences. It's no longer an abstract concept, climate change. I mean, we are living it. But let me go to the only lady on the panel, Aarti, and ask her about this lived experience of climate change versus the international concept, right? Do you see sort of more recognition of what climate change is?
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. And climate is no longer a matter of opinion. It has been turned into a matter of evidence. And when you talk about lived experience, just if you look at the last 10 years, a lot of public perception has changed on how people understand what climate change is. Several surveys have shown that when you reach out to large parts of India, whether it's in the Uttarakhand or Himachal or coastal Maharashtra or even small, medium, large enterprises, there is a difference in how people understand climate is affecting their health, their lives and livelihoods. When this heat wave was on and not letting up in the summer season, around May, an agency conducted a survey where they interviewed 12,000 people across all districts in the country. And very surprisingly, about 60 to 70% of households surveyed had one person falling sick in the month when the heat wave was the worst. We reached out to at least 500 households in coastal Maharashtra. And as a matter of fact, we were quite surprised that our understanding of climate is quite less as opposed to how people who are living at the front lines and margins and are the first witnesses of climate are understanding what climate is impacting, how it's impacting their health, how it's impacting the way they think about their children's future, how it's even affecting their livelihood opportunities. The editor spoke about 2023 being the warmest on record. I think what's very sobering and poignant is it's not just the warmest on record, it's the warmest by the most margin. And there has been evidence which shows that people understand climate change. And I will quote, the Yale study, which is quite remarkable because they have been doing this analysis for several years now. Yale has been a pioneer in splitting America into 7 zones. It's called the 7 Americas study, which shows public opinion on climate across a spectrum. On the one hand, you have people that are alarmed and concerned. On the other hand, you have people which are dismissive and disengaged. And when you repeat the same study in India, the reasons can be quite different. I think at least half of the Americans are alarmed and concerned about climate change. Any guesses on how much percentage would be for India? How many people are alarmed and concerned? I was surprised. More than 85% people are alarmed and concerned about climate. And the reasons are not because they understand climate change as a subject of academics or how the Western press writes about it. It's simply because the lived experience is so high. You talked about the sambar. It's not just the sambar. I think it's our songs, our culture, our script, our infrastructure, our ways in which our civilizational legacies saw what was the fundamental ways to run our lives. Everything will be altered. And public understanding, given how strong it can be in altering even political opinion or policy understanding, will really go a long, long way in how climate is perceived in India. I think the gap really remains on connecting the dots. So much happens in terms of extreme weather events, whether it's the landslides in Himachal or in Tripura or the Wayanad floods, but very less reportage of that really links it to why the reasons are and what climate change is doing to be the driver of these events in the first place. And I suppose if we are able to connect the dots, then public understanding can also just move from information and knowledge to maybe actions and outcomes.
Fantastic. And I think the problem, it's easy to understand the problem if you also view it through the lens of numbers, right? And Amit, you work with on the adaptation side, right? How much is the world and India particularly losing every year because of climate change when it comes to infrastructure and building losses?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, first of all. I had an organization called Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So all of us look at infrastructure, all of us experience infrastructure. Our lived experiences are when the electricity doesn't come, or we're stuck in a flood, or a cyclone comes by and our supply chains are affected. So all of these are experiences, anecdotal, newspapers put it out as anecdotal information. Our responsibility, we are a global organization headquartered in New Delhi. We are part of India's ambition to set up a global organization in India. And what we have tried to do is we've tried to aggregate what is the risk we are carrying globally. And we came out with a study last year, and we found that between 700 and $830 billion is at risk annually because of cyclones. So 6 hazards we looked at: sea level rise, landslides, drought, etc. So when we look at failure of our assets, when our power system transmission lines collapse, or when the airport gets damaged because of a flood, the aggregated cost is $700 to $830 billion, which reflects 1/7 of the annual GDP growth, roughly. Right? That's the amount of risk we are carrying. India itself, we're carrying something in the tune of $38 billion. Now, this is across infrastructure sectors and buildings.
This is every year.
This is every year potential losses. It's an average annual loss. If you look at the insurance industry, when they set premiums, they're saying in a 10-year period, when you collectively add up the losses and then divided by per year, this is the average. So in a given year in India, we could lose up to $38 billion of our assets. I'm not talking about disrupted services. I'm not talking about livelihood impacts. I'm just saying when your assets, the roads get washed away, all of these asset losses, and about 80 to 90% of that loss is related to floods and cyclone, which have, again, climate change related influences.
Right. Let me come to Arun. Do you see a growing realization within the government on climate change, right, and its priorities? And how is India's priorities different from the priorities of developed countries? If you could sort of explain that.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think India's priorities are somewhat different. Let me just run through them. First and foremost, India's priority is energy independence. No matter how you look at it, whether it is $200 billion or $300 billion on energy import costs, it's a debilitating yoke on the Indian economy. So that is a priority. And what solar and wind, together with pumped storage, and eventually green hydrogen do, is provide energy independence hope in the future. The second priority for India is the air quality in its cities. It's a public health disaster. Life expectancies in some of the major cities are 5 to 6 years less than what it should be because of the air quality. And air quality is different from greenhouse emission. It is the particulate matter emission from diesel, from residential sort of use of diesel generators. So electrification for India, like anywhere else in the world, is the only way to reduce greenhouse emission. Even if much of the electricity is coming from thermal power, the battery electric vehicles will reduce the air pollution. And eventually, with green hydrogen costs coming down and infrastructure coming up, heavy-duty trucks and other heavy-duty vehicles will move to green hydrogen because batteries are unlikely to scale up to the heavy-duty vehicle. So that for India is another priority. Third priority, of course, is decarbonization and net zero. India didn't create this problem, but it has to be responsible about it because of the lived experience of what we are facing in India. But the fourth priority is, for the first time, if you look at solar, you look at wind, you look at the green hydrogen value chain, and you convert that into green ammonia, and India has serious level of capability in ammonia because it is one of the largest fertilizer economies in the world, it can compete with anyone on the planet in making green ammonia for exports. Who would have thought that India can dare to export green energy? And our chairman has been talking about it, and he's committed to making this happen. So I see the country's priorities as these four. And if you do these things, many of the other things, not all the challenges, but if air quality in cities improves, if we have, if we have energy independence, then the public finances can be used to mitigation and adaptation. And that's how India has to play its game, not be browbeaten by the Western thing that shut down coal or this. Coal will eventually exit. India has 2070 to do. And there are mechanisms, and I can talk about decarbonization at a later point if there is interest.
Of course, India's priorities are different, right? You cannot sacrifice growth. So it's a difficult choice. But Saurabh, if you could talk about how we are doing in terms of decarbonization, right? And what are the challenges that you see as we progress towards that net zero goal?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I completely agree with Mr. Sharma that this is a great opportunity that India has, not just in one aspect that he highlighted, but in several aspects. And let me begin by saying why I'm saying this. India is as Mr. Sharma rightly said, we are a responsible nation. We did not create this problem, but we are a big part of the solution. And why this is a big part of the solution is, if you look at any developed country, and I'll include China into this, in their journey towards being a developed country, they have used cheap fossil fuels to really come to where they are. India does not have that choice, and we don't want to do that choice. And therefore, India has to tread a path which is very different. Develop using, first making green energy affordable, and then developing using that green energy, not just wind and solar, but hydrogen, ammonia, and so on and so forth. So this gives an incredible opportunity to not just show to the world that, but also become a Vishwaguru for the larger global south. And therefore, these energy transitions that we are seeing and we will see continuously have a very important lesson for virtually every developing country in the world. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Look at the PM Suryaghar Yojana that it initially aims to put 10 million rooftops. Now, this is the biggest just energy transition that you can ever think of. You're making energy, those 10 million households energy independent. How do we take this to other parts of the country? And what we have seen and what our work with largely states, we have seen that there's enormous potential to really forge a way forward. And I'll give you the example of Maharashtra, where we have helped the Maharashtra government to develop a short-term 2030 energy transition plan, looking at their load growth, looking at how they can integrate more of renewables, what are the gaps that exist. And what we see is that if that plan, which includes not just renewables, but also hydrogen, it also includes digitization of the grid, which is extremely important. If it is done properly, this would reduce the DISCOM debt by 50%, because your reliance on high-cost power reduces because of cheap renewables. So what you need is build capacity of the institutions at the state level, This plan, just one state, needs about $30 billion. And that's why we need a coalition of people like MDBs, governments, we have the environment funds, philanthropies, all have to work together, have a role to play in creating new models of financing, new instruments of financing, de-risking the sector, because of the $30 billion, nearly 70% should come from the private sector, because that's really more efficient and more. So I think what is needed to get a good energy transition plan in state by state has to be a bottom-up approach, has to be a very granular exercise, not just looking at a plan, but looking at how do you finance that plan, how do you build capabilities of state-level institutions, and how do you get different kinds of financial instruments in so that we can leverage the private sector more.
Mr. Mundol, can you elaborate on the financial part a little more, right? We are talking of $1 trillion. Is that what we need for transition?
You're asking me?
So the short answer, and there are different estimates, but it's between $1 to $2.5 trillion. And just one point on that, which is that, and I'm on a previous speaker, climate change is caused not just by what you do today and in the future, but what you've done since the start of the industrial age. India is responsible for about 4% of historical emissions, so theoretically we have 4% of the problem. And therefore there is perfect justification in the government and the country asking for those kind of financing flows. We need to be real though. The political economy just simply does not exist in the rich world for the $1, $2, $3 trillion to come. The majority of Indian equity is held by domestic investors. The majority of capital that's going to be required is going to have to be generated by domestic sources. And just taking the one step forward, capital will get invested when there are returns. And it's inspiring to see so many of you in the room. First of all, thank you for having me as well. The business leaders, many of you in the room, your objectives are shareholder value, revenues, profits. Those are the parameters that you measured on. Why should you care about climate change? You should care about it because it is not only the crisis of the century, but it is the business opportunity of the century. And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 quick examples of where there is real value being generated by going greener. I know other speakers will be speaking about it as well, but the Indian cement sector is regarded as amongst the greenest in the world. The best performing cement companies use 85% of their raw material is fly ash, which is waste product from thermal power plants. These bulbs that you see, 250 years ago, they invented an incandescent bulb. Technology didn't change for 200 years. LED bulbs come in. They last longer, they use less energy, and this is now a multi-billion-dollar a year industry in India alone. High efficiency ceiling fans, again, a billion-dollar industry in India. So there's loads of 1.5 million electric vehicles were sold last year in India. The majority of them were scooters and 3-wheelers for last mile delivery. There are significant pockets where you're seeing that growth. People are doing this not necessarily because they love the environment, they love their bottom lines, and that's perfectly fine.
Right. Arun, would you like to talk a little bit about what the Adani Group is doing in terms of decarbonization? Just taking off from the cement example that...
So, as I said, electrification is the most important vector for decarbonization. And given Adani Group is into thermal, is into renewables, is into transmission, is into distribution, is into pumped storage, and we are looking at the green hydrogen value chain. So we are doing everything for decarbonization. But let me just tell you, take 2 examples, or 3 examples of the most difficult sectors we have: thermal power, Adani Total Gas, and cement. In thermal power, India, by all accounts, has to maintain thermal power capacity for the next 2 decades. And what we have looked at is how can we significantly reduce the emissions of a thermal power plant. Now, you can't use green hydrogen directly. It's very combustible. But if you convert that into green ammonia, the combustion point of coal and green ammonia is very similar, and the Japanese have perfected this technology, and the Chinese are behind on their heels. We are doing a feasibility study in Mundra of a 330 megawatt thermal power plant, which will co-fire 20% green ammonia, which will roughly reduce its emission by 20%. The cost of the fuel increases, but it is still cheaper than a natural gas-fired power plant. And if you take the upstream emission from Texas with fracking, it actually is the same with 20% reduction. We can't beat Qatar. For that, we have to go to 40%, but that becomes prohibitively expensive. So that's what we are doing in thermal power. Adani Total Gas is doing an experiment of blending green hydrogen in Shantigram for 4,000 homes, initially starting with 2%, going to 8%. At $1.5 a kilogram of green hydrogen, which we believe will happen mid-2030s, it's the same thing as $11 to $12 of natural gas imported. And it can start transitioning to green hydrogen, the city gas distribution. All you have to do is next time the CapEx upgrade comes, make the pipes hydrogen ready. Cement, I totally agree with you. We acquired the assets from Holcim. They're not only using fly ash, they're using slag from blast furnace, and they're among some of the least emission-intensive cement businesses in the world. But no matter what you do, what you try, you have to have certain amount of carbon capture to get to net zero. Now, what do you do with that carbon? India does not have sequestration reserves. You will have to liquefy the carbon dioxide, you will have to put it on a ship and rent expensive space in Saudi Arabia to store it. And I can tell you that as the European 2050 net zero target comes in, the rental space will keep going up. So it's not a viability. So what we are doing is looking at a pilot for carbon capture from the cement plant, and then with our green hydrogen value chain, converting that into methanol. The European Union has decided to call it green methanol because it is process emission. And so it creates an economic incentive to go that way. But in the long term, you can take that methanol and convert that into building materials like PVC, which stores the carbon dioxide for 100 years. So that's the value chain. What green hydrogen allows and what industrial process carbon dioxide allows is an alternative to natural gas in the long term. At the right price point, at $1.5, all these things become feasible. Now, we are looking very, very seriously at pilots in this decade so that we are ready for prime time as we are able to bring down the cost of green hydrogen.
Right. Mr. Mundol, on the question of the money needed, if the global north doesn't have the money, right, for the global south, why are we even lobbying for it?
Sometimes in politics you have to get the narrative right, so there's two ways of looking at it. One is India only standing up at these climate conferences and saying, give us 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, and then not doing anything at all? That would be silly. That's luckily not what we're doing. So we need to keep making those asks. Climate finance is slowly coming through. But we're often enamored by the concept of green finance, the green financing facilities. And sure, we need more of that money to come in. But the biggest driver is making regular finance greener, making sure that the big investment shops, the domestic institutional investors in India, start thinking about climate risk. If you're buying into a 60-year, if you're investing capital into a blast furnace for a steel operation, this thing is going to last for 60 years. In 10 years, it's unlikely to be able to sell a gram into Europe. In 20 years, because of both its emission profile and its costs, it's unlikely to be competitive in India. So rework those economics in a different way. There is another reason I just wanted to add, and just building on your point, Arun, on hydrogen. Right now, the cost of hydrogen is roughly $4 to $5 a liter. It needs to go down to $1.5. How is that going to come? It's going to come through investment in R&D. And the one warning sign for Indian industry is we're simply not spending enough as a country on R&D. I'm not talking about climate in general. As a nation, we should be spending much more. We spend as a nation 0.6% of GDP compared to industrial averages of 1.6. The US is at 3.5%. And of the R&D that's spent in the country, 40% comes from the private sector. In industrial countries, it's 70%. So we need more money going into R&D, and we need more private sector money going.
Saurabh, do you agree with that? We are under-investing in R&D. Is
Yeah,
that...
I think that's the statistics really are correct, and especially from the private sector side. But coming back to where is the money, and I think one of the major things that has actually started off during India's G20 presidency is this whole issue of MDB reforms. I mean, they no longer seem to be something that is really putting focus on. What we have seen is, and our leadership, including the Honorable Prime Minister, has been saying that the Bretton Woods system needs a complete overhaul. They were designed for something different, and now the challenges of climate needs to make them very, very different from what they are. Having worked in the government for long and dealt with these MDBs, I can tell you, they are becoming completely risk averse. They really don't want to do anything but do a plain vanilla lending to a sovereign. Now, what they need to do is to shift focus from a pure vanilla sovereign-based lending. Instead, the MDB money should be able to leverage private sector, which is currently not happening at all. And therefore, if you see that transitions will happen, we can talk about $1 trillion or $2 trillion. The fact remains, where is the public money? Right. The small little public money has to, as he just said, that you have to mitigate risk and provide enough returns for a private investor so that that volume of money comes in the sector that you are looking at.
Yeah, I'll come to you, Arun, but Aarti, you had a point on pension funds, right? Pension funds is a veritable source of raising money. Is that correct?
Well, I think climate finance, as it's called, has been the biggest elephant in the room. If you look at it internationally, like Saurabh said, there is huge discussion on why there is no public money that is available. And when you look at even $1 trillion, in the international negotiations now, there is a lot of discussion on what is the makeup of that $1 trillion, meaning what's the quality of finance that's available. And at least half of it, 500, 600 billion, as we read various reports and proposals, looks like it's going to come from private investment. So if it is going to come from private investment, you can either break that down into money that is investment and not grants or loans. And the inherent sentiment when you're talking of financing is one of payback. And I suppose, especially for this audience, one of profitability. Till the time you don't convert investment into a profitable venture, I don't think even our solar industry would have taken on the way it has taken on its own life. So these are all the various aspects of how finance is not just very technical, it's also very stressful because there is no leverage. When somebody like a pension fund invests in a certain technology where you have a market for it, there is profitability, there is a proper return on investment for 10 or 15 years, and there is cost competitiveness, then there is a ray of hope that you can invest in a certain set of technologies which will lead to a certain outcome. It feels like there are lots of technologies that are lying out there, you know. Previous speakers, and especially Mr. Sharma has talked about green hydrogen. There is stuff on electric vehicles. Is there something to be done on how to make sure that in future when electric vehicles come, the charging stations themselves are not clogged and we have a better way of dealing with setting up proper like charging grids all across the country? Is there something to be done to move away from just lithium and to move into technologies which are better, which don't have reliability on lithium and cobalt? And there is a role of private investment, there is a role of sovereign wealth funds, there is a role of pension funds in looking at this new nascent technologies, I suppose, and in making them the real champions of future. Because it is true that whether or not we think of climate as a main concern, large parts of India at least will cross 1.5 or 2 degrees by 2035. The world is not negotiating on a 2-degree pathway. Governments are negotiating on a 2.6 through to 3 degrees pathway. And several models across the world, which the scientific community have done, have shown that by 2050, when the world has electrified everything and the industry has decarbonized itself completely, we will be 500 parts per million. Today, we are 420 parts per million, and we are already seeing runaway climate change. When we become 500 parts per million, large parts of the world will be unlivable, never mind the security and the independence that we need. So I think there is a huge lift that is needed. Any source of finance which can have its market, its cost competitiveness, as well as its return on investments, and this group will understand that better than somebody like me who's not a technical person, is something which should be a case of show and tell on how we should bring more investments, and pension funds across the world to play a large part in it.
Arun, you had a point on financing.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. One is on R&D. We have to understand that 25 years ago, India and China, R&D capabilities were very similar. But I think what China did was invest in R&D. Whereas what India did was produce the largest number of MBAs who had engineering and computer science background. So India has done better in business model innovation and producing globally leading CEOs. The Chinese have done that. I can tell you what happened with photovoltaics. My old university, University of New South Wales, is where the technology for photovoltaics was developed. 90% of the solar modules in the world use technology from there. They took the technology from there and Fraunhofer and invested $160 billion to create a competitive edge that no country on the planet can match. They did the same thing with batteries. What India has to do is can't wait for 25 years, but work with Japan, work with US, work with Europe, combine their R&D with Indian bill of materials, Indian labor costs to create value in these. So almost create a China by using their R&D and the human scale. Now, coming back to finance, let me just tell you, it's total nonsense on the part of the West. If you look at India's economy, the greenhouse emission intensity for US is around 190 million tons per $1 trillion of GDP. For Europe, it's 160 million tons. For China, it's around 580. For India, it's 780. Okay? So no one is going to stop India from adding trillions of dollars of economy every few years. And the easiest way that the West can address climate change is to finance, make the cost of capital for the Indian private sector that has risen up to the policy framework in India to undertake the rollout of renewable. That one single way to make the cost of finance the same will do more for climate change, and they should stop giving you 30 different parameters on ESG. Just one simple thing, make the cost of capital competitive for the private sector to roll out renewables, and that will have the greatest impact.
Amit, yes, sorry.
So I think I'm going to take it a little bit far away from the cost of capital towards making capital more efficient. Right? I think part of the whole adaptation narrative is, if I look around the room, I don't know how many people actually understand what are the problems climate is posing to you and what do you see as an opportunity. So if you're a business person sitting in the room and you're saying, it's getting hotter, there's more flooding, there's more rainfall, I think looking at your own portfolio of investments and understanding, I'm putting things in for the long term. If I'm putting things in for the long term, how is that climate change going to affect my long-term investment? If you can be ahead of it, and if you can articulate it, I think capital is also scared because there's a whole perception of risk that capital doesn't understand. So as a business, it's an opportunity actually to say, I understand what my long-term risks are, and I'm already taking measures today to address them. That may attract you more capital because you're already doing it compared to others. That's the long term. In the immediate, this was the hottest year, and maybe next year will be the hottest year. How is your business practice suffering? Where are your employees coming from? Who's looking at your own complete list of people. All of us can be in air-conditioned rooms, but you've got staff working for you in the construction industry and other industries. Is the productivity suffering? There's enough studies to show that productivity does go down when it gets hotter. So how do you improve your business practices where you're addressing that extreme heat problem to make sure that your construction worker is not suffering? Part of it is, where is the innovative opportunity? I think we're sitting in one of the countries where heat has been around for a very long time. This is an opportunity to come up with solutions that we can actually export to the world. I had a chance to work in Athens, Greece. It's going to be the hottest city in Europe, and we're talking about 34, 35, 36 degree temperature. Delhi has dealt with 45, 46, 47, right? So how can we put together these solutions? And I'm actually challenging the business community to say, don't look at heat as only a problem. Also see what have we been doing differently. Is it our business practices? We are not shipping or we are not moving goods at a certain time. The last point is around supply chains. I'm sitting in the infrastructure space. All of you are relying on your goods services to be, the whole supply chain connectivity. You're relying on infrastructure, good infrastructure. Pay a little bit more attention to see how do we secure that infrastructure for the future so your own supply chains are not getting affected.
Actually, Delhi breached 50 this time for a day or so. But we can take some audience questions. We have a few minutes. Any questions for our panelists? You can just raise your hand. The gentleman over there in white. Please identify yourself and...
Hello, sir. My name is Amod Anand, and I'm the founder of a company called Loom Solar. We are in the rooftop solar industry. So just sir said that PM Surya Ghar Yojana is going to change the big game. So I just want to know from this aspect of the distributed solar energy. So how this is going to solve the big problem of this climate change?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
So essentially, the decentralized solar means you generate at the consumption end itself, right? And it's a clean source of power. Therefore, you don't need to take power through a transmission line, and rooftop solar is not just the only example. We have in India 150 gigawatts, which is 150,000 megawatts load for the agriculture sector. Now that also needs completely solarized. So you reduce your reliance on fossil fuel energy. You also don't need to invest in transmission and distribution infrastructure, and the losses that are there in a system actually go away. In case of rooftop, there is no loss at all. And also, if you have a solar power plant which is near a rural substation that feeds the pumps, the losses go down dramatically, and therefore you reduce the emissions that you would have otherwise been doing.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yeah, at the back, please. Yeah. I see a hand, but I can't. Right. Okay. Please identify yourself.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Kalyani. I'm a freelance consultant working on sustainability and international relations issues. My question is about the point that was raised about MDB reform. You talked about, the focus not being so much on reform this year while it was there with the Indian G20 presidency. I want to know what is it that MDBs can do in terms of, changing their approach or developing new tools that will help them convince even their stakeholders that climate change is the issue to invest in. Thank you.
Aarti, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, by nature, multilateral development banks are intergovernmental. There is politics involved. With the general collapse in the world these days, it's very hard to imagine that any country, either even the way even the developed world is both suffering political turmoil as well as climate turmoil, it's becoming harder and harder for every government to put money out where it's not addressing climate adaptation and mitigation directly at home and is, in service to other countries. So that, I suppose, in and of itself is the first reason why even a lot of the developed countries who are on the chairs of the multilateral development banks are unable to reform the process. If you look at it on the other side, as was alluded to before, India at the G20 last year made this huge call, even by inducting Africa, by talking about the voice of Global South. And that, is a narrative which should be pushed, because the question about finance is not about a moral imperative or a social obligation or something about reparations of the past. I think it's a question really about how we are looking into the future. And I suppose if MDBs and those who are responsible for decision making can really see that angle as not one of just the moral imperative to act, but also of one of decision making that is responsible in the future. There was a point made really about just bringing the cost of capital down for renewables. It's 9%, 10%, whatever in India, maybe 3% in Germany. Even if there are pieces that are picked from there where MDBs can pick up and make a change, I think it will be a huge leverage.
Clearly, there's a lot to do. And on that note, we'll have to wrap up this panel. Thank you, Aarti. Thank you, gentlemen. It was lovely talking to you.